I want to welcome Agile XRM to the podcast. I've known the people at Agile XRM for the past 12 years. I've seen how their business process management tool can add massive value to complex organizational processes in sectors such as finance and government. If you have complex processes or a need for dialogues on the Power Platform or Dynamics 365, take a look at how this BPM tool can add value. You can find them at agilexrm.com or check out the show notes for more details. Welcome to the Power Platform Show. Today is an interesting topic. We're going to talk about inclusiveness on so many different levels and are really looking forward to our future where we see neurodiverse individuals are a key part of our community and the creation of the apps, the automations, the transformations that we bring about in business. I'm excited about where we're going in the space. So sit back, have a listen to Venkat as we discuss this topic. Today's guest is from Chicago in the United States. He's the Director of Power Platform Go-to-Market Lead at Avanade. He's a blogger, photographer, and random idea generator. During his free time, you can find him hiking, exploring bike trails, reading, listening to podcasts, and attending concerts and making music. You can find him on Twitter at DigiTransform. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes because it's spelled uniquely. And check out his blog, assistivetechnologyblog.com. Welcome to the show, Venkat Rao.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for having me.
Did I get that all right? I see you're a musician. You like concerts. Sounds
I'm a
awesome.
jack of all trades, master of none, Mark. That's what it is. You got it all right, though.
Fantastic. So tell us a bit about family, food, and fun. What do they mean to you?
Means everything, actually. So for me, my focus on life is on things that bring me a lot of joy. And that all comes from family, food, and fun. So I'm fortunate enough to have an upbringing where my parents and my sister, very progressive, very open-minded. And growing up, I did a lot of reading. And I mean, basically everything that you just explained in my bio, I enjoyed all of that growing up. And I admired a lot of these activities and not just focus on just career, just education. And, it's important to mention this because, I come from India and, Indian families, the Indian culture is very much, there's a very heavy emphasis on your career and your education, etc. Fun random fact, as a 16-year-old, I wanted to be a musician. I actually wanted to be a roadie for REM, the band. But my family was like, no, you're going to college instead, right? So when I look back, I'm grateful for going to college. But, that's how my upbringing was. I dabbled in a lot of things, and that has persisted. Food, of course, is essential, not just in terms of the ability to live, but also, I cook on a daily basis and I find cooking very therapeutic. It's a very nice distraction and I absolutely enjoy cooking for others. For me, cooking it's a way of life. It's a chore. It's something that it's like, oh, all right, okay, I'll cook again tonight. But when I have to cook for someone else, I derive a lot of pleasure out of it. So family, food, fun means everything to me, Mark.
That's awesome. Tell us about, or sell me on Chicago. Why is it a great place to live?
Oh, where do I even begin? So, Chicago is one of those bigger cities in this world where, so big cities usually are overwhelming and intimidating. So, like New York City comes to mind, for example, right? So it's that big, bad concrete jungle where everyone is mean and the population is dense. People don't care for you. And, there's a lot of hustle bustle and you're just somehow surviving. And that's a general theme when it comes to big cities, lots of traffic and pollution and this and that. I think Chicago is a gem in that it's the exact opposite of what every other big city you can think of. I mean, if yes, it's a concrete jungle, but the people are not as mean, they're fairly friendly. And I think it comes from that Chicago being in the Midwest, which, Midwest in the US is considered like a friendlier region compared to the rest of the country. So it has that going for it. And, it goes without saying that Chicago is very rich in culture. It has an amazing like music scene and, restaurants and lots of like summer activities, and has a major airport, so connected to the rest of the world. And also I feel like Chicago is placed so like strategically, even in the US, that reaching different parts of the country is fairly easy. So any flight you take, it's not as long, so like 2 to 3 hours and you are at your destination. So, lots of things going for Chicago, and I always wanted to live in Chicago. So I think that part of my dream has come true.
Yeah, I've definitely commuted through Chicago a few times. Unfortunately, I've never stepped outside the airport, and all for Microsoft events running at various locations across the US. But when you say, you always wanted to live there, why was that?
So I went to graduate school 2 hours south of Chicago. So, I got my MBA from this university called Illinois State University, which is 2 hours south of Chicago. And back then, when I was going to school, my sister lived in Chicago. And whenever I had like vacation or a longer extended break, I would just take the train and go visit my sister. So that's how I got familiar with the city of Chicago. And so because I had a break, I would just go and venture out in the city. My sister would go to work, but I would just like wander around in the city. And that's when like I just fell in love with it. So since then, I sort of fantasized about living in Chicago, and finally here I am.
Nice. So tell me about your story. How did you get to do what you do now? How did all those parts fall into place, and why did you choose the path you're on?
Yeah, so I think I have like a two-legged story here. So in that, one track is my day job, the other track is my, side activity, which is related to assistive technology and accessibility. So, my day job, like the boring detail here is that I do Power Platform for Avanade, and like I bring in a lot of business. I have a lot of fun with it, and I only say that it's boring. It's because it's a day job, right? It's something that we all have to do. But then my side activity, my evening job, if I may, is I run this blog on assistive technology. You introduced it earlier. It's called assistive-technology-blog.com, and that's where I write about technology for disabled people, and it's things usually that are upcoming or not very well known. It's something that people are experimenting with, perhaps, or something that a new company introduced to the market, or it's a new inventor who has created a new product or a new service, and it's to like highlight their efforts, etc. So I gather a lot of joy out of that activity. So that's what I do in the evenings. And how I got there, Mark, is again, as I was getting my MBA from Illinois State University. So in the US, there's a system where you can be what's known as a graduate assistant. What that means is that you are a student worker. Okay, so of course you're going to university, attending classes, but then you're also a student worker, and you get to work with a certain department. So you work like 20 hours a week, you get a monthly stipend, and in return, they waive off your tuition. Okay, so yeah, so I was a graduate assistant at this department, which is now called Student Access and Accommodation Services. And the whole idea there was to provide the right accommodations to students and faculty with disabilities. So, if you have like blind students taking classes, deaf students, or anyone with, any other sorts of like intellectual disability, perhaps. So my department provided them with the right accommodation, which means that for a blind student, it could be a book that's converted to Braille, or a book that's converted to, like an audio book. For a deaf student, it could be, providing with a sign language interpreter. in the class, or providing a note taker who would take notes for them in the class, etc. Right. So for every type of disability, there was an accommodation that was provided. So I worked for that department. And so that's when I was actually introduced to assistive technology on a much larger scale. And I was absolutely amazed and spellbound by, like the kind of things my department was generating for disabled students. I fell in love with that whole concept of accessibility and assistive technology, and more so because I used to interact with students directly. So I saw them in action on how they would operate assistive technology for their own needs. And again, a fun fact here. So there was a student that got our services, and he was a computer science student, super smart, super brilliant, and he would come to me and tell me, he would be like, Venkat, oh, by the way, just so for some background, they used a website for like requesting things, right? And that website would have like all these queries running in the background, like SQL queries and whatnot. So this guy figured those queries out through his screen reader, and he came to me and he said, hey, Venkat, like if you do this query in a different way, you will get much better results. Like I don't remember the exact conversation, but that whole engagement with him, it just blew my mind away. So that was my first interaction with a blind person who could figure out what a SQL query is doing without actually even looking at it, right? So those kinds of interactions and encounters really made me fascinated by assistive technology and accessibility. And then I graduated with my MBA. And then a few years later, I was just staring out the window, Mark. I mean, there was nothing going on. I just like a blank mind. I was staring out the window and I thought, let me just start writing about this stuff. So without any goals, without any objectives, I just signed up for Blogger, and started this blog, started writing about assistive technology stuff without really understanding what blogging really is, and should I be monitoring my audience, should I be like creating the right content, etc. It was none of that. It was just blindly writing. And then 6 to 8 months later, I realized that people actually read this stuff, and I was very pleasantly, yes, surprised, but also shocked, because I never thought that anyone else besides me would read this stuff, right? So, and then I kept writing, and then soon enough, my blog started showing up on like, top 50 blogs for parents with kids with special needs, or top 40 blogs for special education teachers, etc. So, I mean, that was just the beginning, and then since then, I've continued writing, and it's not like a very big blog, but it has its audience. There are occupational therapists, professors, sign language interpreters, or parents who have disabled kids. There's a certain audience that I think appreciates the blog and its content, and yeah, so that's what keeps me going.
This is so interesting and such a unique area, and I really want to unpack it in a bit more detail. I noticed some of the categories on your blog is around autism, vision, hearing, Lego. What's the Lego section? Prosthetics, wheelchair, and campaigns. Yeah.
Yes.
What's the Lego?
Like I said earlier, I write about things that are not necessarily mainstream, right? So it may be things that people don't even think of. Speaking of Lego, so one thing that Lego excels at is enabling prototyping. Okay, so if you're thinking of any solution or a product, and if you don't have the right, if you don't really have a vision of like, okay, how can I really build this? I still don't understand what all material go into it. One thing that I would encourage everyone who's listening to do is look at Legos, because so the Lego building blocks, not just the building blocks, but also, now it has all these motors and sensors, etc. This Lego ecosystem brings to life a lot of abilities that you may be thinking of or you may be imagining. Right. And all of this happens like fairly quickly because it's all Legos, and you're just like quickly building and playing and prototyping and experimenting. If something that doesn't work, just undo it, build it again in some other way. And you have all these sensors that they can detect objects, or they can detect sound, etc. So there's a lot of like prototyping that happens through Legos, and I think you will see that people have built prosthetic arms with Lego sets. And where it really shines is especially with children. So if you give a child a prosthetic arm that is always looking the same, I mean, sure, it's doing its job, but then it's boring, right? And children get bored very easily. So why not create a prosthetic arm that can have some like Lego element to it, where, hey, you're today you have a Superman sitting on your Lego arm. Tomorrow it's Iron Man. The day after it can be something else, or you can change the look and feel of your prosthetic arm. So it's things like that where something like Lego really lets your imagination run wild, and you can do all sorts of things and just figure out what works, what doesn't work through these Lego building blocks. So, Mark, that's a great question. I personally believe in our local communities, and I personally want everyone around us to flourish and be successful and live fulfilling lives. Now, when we talk about our communities, and I don't know how often everyone thinks about our communities, but there are many, many building blocks that our like local communities have, right? So think about any grocery store that's enabling us to fulfill our basic needs. There are schools that are empowering our children to have successful careers. There are the city government, for example, it's providing public transportation and parks and recreation for our own a satisfaction. So there's so much that's going on in a community, and the more you think about it, the more complex yet fascinating it gets. Now, having said that, I think we all understand that not everyone has equal access to resources and the support system that our communities have, right? And it may be because of our financial background, it may be because of our racial or cultural background, but not everything is equal for everyone. What I will also say is now having said that, there is a lot of emphasis on making everything smart, for example, right? So now, to put things in perspective, according to the UN, there will be 6.25 billion people living in urban settings by the year 2050. And out of those 6.25 billion people, 15% will be disabled. And also, this is something that's not talked about very prominently, but there is some mention of, like making cities smart, making communities smart. So there's an emphasis on technology there, right? Now, we are talking about urban settings here, but similarly, parallelly, there is an emphasis on making rural areas somewhat empowered as well by introducing, say, broadband internet. So the idea is to bring equality in some sense to wherever we are. And I feel like this is the right time to reconsider how our communities are set up. And more so because, in the last 4 to 5 years, I think, and especially during the pandemic, there has been very strong focus on kindness and empathy and, climate change, social justice, racial justice. And I think like bringing all these things together with a little flavor of technology. And I think that all of this combined can really enable us to, like I said, revisit our communities, see how they are modeled, and really make some changes, because the traditional society and the community that we know of course, it's full of like inequality and, missing pieces here and there. And I believe that with what we have today, society has seen such a paradigm shift in how we operate, and thanks to technology, I really think that we can enable our community members and really enable them to be a lot more successful and live very fulfilling lives.
So if we were to bring this home and look at, you work for a large company that produces apps on the Power Platform, as do I. Mm-hmm. If we're going to look beyond just creating, and we're going to talk about accessible apps and, that type of thing that affects the communities we're running in, but let's talk about creating a work environment where the app creators, the automation creators, the people that have come up with, the ideators, the visionaries, etc., that we're tapping in and engaging much more communities, whether it be neurodiversity or any of the areas that you cover on your site, assistive technology blog. If we're to look at it right in our actual, backyard, so to speak, what can we be doing in our companies today that make it a place where people can come and work with, that we've got enabling technologies, we've got enabling processes, we've got enabling environments for everybody. So how do we bring this home specifically to our workplaces? You work for a large corporate that builds solutions for many customers, as do I. And I really want to unpack what can we do? How can we create an environment for creators that are that may need assistive technologies, that maybe neurodiversity is in play. All the how do we, more than just creating accessible apps and accessible products, how do we create an accessible environment tool set so that our creators, so we can bring diversity to what we create by including all people, if you like, within our workforce, within our environments, and with even the tool sets that we use, that we can have everybody getting involved in building, the apps, the automations, the ideations of the future?
Yep. Great question, Mark, and so much to unpack here. And I think before we get into actually answering, how do we make an environment accessible, if we can take a step back and really understand the current scenario. I feel like it's very important to understand that there is a lot of ableism that's prevalent in our society. And what that really means is that, there are disabled people and then there are able-bodied people. So anyone who can use their body parts the way they're intended to, they don't have any like intellectual disabilities, etc. They operate in a quote unquote normal way. And again, that normal word is it's kind of taboo because society has made us think that whoever is able-bodied is normal, right? Which is not the case. But let's just stick to that for the sake of this conversation. So traditionally, we have always made things for the able-bodied person. We don't necessarily think about, oh, what if someone is blind? Or what if someone is an amputee? What if someone has an intellectual disability, right? What if they're nonverbal? We don't necessarily go into those areas. And I think from the world that we belong to, Mark, you and I, we come from the Dynamics background, right? And now Power Platform. And usually, almost always, the emphasis is on automation. So, here's a manual task. Let me automate it for you through, like a Power App or Dynamics or, a Cloudflow, etc. But then we don't necessarily think about who the audience is, right? So, and generally speaking, we default towards the ableism angle, right? So where we just think that, oh yeah, whoever we are automating this for, they'll be able to use a keyboard, they'll be able to use a mouse, and they won't have any problems with their vision, etc. So that's how we have traditionally approached solutioning. So I think one thing to unlearn here is the whole ableism aspect, where don't assume that anyone who is using our solution ultimately will be able to use it with their hands or their voice, etc. And that's where we can start segueing into the universal design aspect, where we build the solution in such a way that it's inclusive of everyone. And there are ways to do it, right? So there are certain foundational concepts that you apply, but the idea is to make whatever that we are building and creating for a much wider audience and not just able-bodied people. So I think these are some foundational ideas to keep in mind as and when we either create solutions or we create an environment where people can collaborate. Another thing that is very important, and again, coming from like a dynamics background, we focused way too much on development. We don't focus a lot on design. And accessibility. Just to keep things simple, accessibility belongs to the design world, where if you have access to like a UI UX person, they are able to bring a much more insightful approach towards accessibility, because a lot of it, again, it's not just about, oh, I'm going to add an accessibility label and make this accessible for a blind person, but it's also about how is the experience for a disabled person made better through accessibility or design practices, right? So if possible, if someone has access to like design folks, I would encourage a collaboration between designers and developers, because that's when a developer can suggest what can be done and what cannot be done, and the designer will say what needs to be done to make this experience seamless for whoever is using, right? So there are these like newer nuances that we especially have to deal with, and only for making everything much more fluid and nice for the end user, whether they're disabled or not. The other thing is, I mean, if you look at consulting companies who like bigger consulting companies may have access to like design people, but there are developers out there, whether you're a freelancer or whether you work for a smaller shop, you may not necessarily have access to designers or accessibility experts. Just understanding that you don't have to master this right away. First of all, acknowledge that there's a need for accessibility or universal design. Start with that solid foundation, and just know that even if you apply just the basics of universal design to any solution or environment you're creating, that is a huge win. So that's a great starting point. And after that, later on, learn more, enable yourself more to build much more accessible solutions. But where I'm going with all of this is, whoever belongs to our world of, say, Power Platform, we need to just change our thinking. We need to acknowledge that, yeah, I'm not just building something for an able-bodied person. I will have people who are disabled. So how can I include them in my solution as well? And also, Mark, I mean, what actually happens is you would never know that the end users, there's probably someone who's disabled, because the disabled person is not needed to disclose that they have a disability, right? So it's not necessary, it's not required. So how do you make sure then that what you're building is right for your audience? So again, the emphasis on universal design, right? Because it's a lot more work to fix something. It's a lot more work to make something that's inaccessible accessible, versus starting with the right foundation and going with like a all-inclusive universal design approach, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how about, though, including people on your design team that have, that may be vision impaired, that may, have that, as I say, neurodiversity, come from a background where they're, autism or dyslexia. I'm just thinking that perhaps if we added them into our design and build teams, we're going to have much better outputs, much better outcomes from the get-go, rather than having, if you like, this concept of an able-bodied person trying to interpret what's needed and therefore suggest design.
Absolutely. And you've said the most accurate thing here, including people who will actually be the persona of the end user, right? Like including them in discussions right away. So whether it's in your design team, whether it's in your testing team, it's always very important to have input from someone who is disabled, because they're the ones who will give you the right insight. I may, as an able-bodied person, I may try to mimic what it looks like or what it feels like for a blind person to use an app. I may possibly use a screen reader and test it out, and I'm using air quotes here, but it's still not the real thing, right? So the person who will actually use the system or the solution, including them in design conversations, in testing and feedback conversations. I think that's what makes accessibility a lot more important. And it really puts, so, whoever is the other parties who are involved, not just the builders and not just the end users, but the people who are funding the project, the people, the C-level people, or whoever else that's somehow involved in the delivery of a certain project, it's important for them to understand also that why is it that we are doing this? It's because we want to make the solution a lot more, bulletproof, right? So we don't want any surprises. We don't want to make assumptions. So if we can, again, have a solid foundation, have disabled people in our initial discussions, it only makes things better in the long run.
Mm. How can Microsoft improve the Power Platform to make it more inclusive in your mind? Is there anything that you've seen that you thought, what, this would be awesome if they added this to make it more inclusive?
Yes. So I think Microsoft has done a decent job with Power Platform accessibility. So, you may notice that as you build a Canvas app, for example, each control, whether it's a text box or a drop down, they have an accessibility label, for example. So the accessibility label is meant to be read by screen readers. So whoever is blind, they will use a screen reader, and the screen reader, as the name suggests, is just reading things off of the screen. So you're not seeing the screen, but you're only hearing things out loud. So providing things like accessibility labels definitely helps. But in my experience, there are some surprises here and there. The accessibility doesn't always work. And because Microsoft has such a huge emphasis on accessibility, and they've made all these promises, they have such a grand vision for bringing accessibility on a much larger scale. I think, especially for Power Platform, and this is something that I've commented on, whenever someone from Microsoft Accessibility posts something on LinkedIn, I bring these things up. So if they can have an accessibility guide towards how to build or how to incorporate universal design or accessibility into, say, Canvas apps or model-driven apps, and not just make it a feature in their documentation, but actually creating a guide, create a dummies, accessibility dummies or something like that, right? I think that will make a huge impact, because a lot of content that's out there, if you Google search, you will get overwhelmed with, how to make your apps accessible, etc. Right? So there's a lot of content like that, but if Microsoft creates something that's meant for its own product or its platform, I think that's a huge win, and it just brings in accessibility to the table right from stage one, right? So it's something that possibly may not be able to avoid, because Microsoft says, hey, just build this in here, we will help you, things like that.
I like it. Is there any resources or forums, training materials that you want to share with the audience that you recommend that?
Yes, I will. So Mark, the thing with accessibility is that it gets overwhelming. Once you start, you realize that actually there's a lot that goes into it. Because we are not just talking about, I'll make my app be read by a screen reader, but also how can a person with autism, how can that person use my app without much trouble? How can, what about colorblind people? What kind of color schemes should I use? And there are so many other nuances, technical nuances that have to be incorporated into a solution. So once you get into this area, you're like, oh, wow, this is a rabbit hole. I will have to invest my time and energy into this to really understand accessibility and become more confident on this topic. Now, having said that, there are some quick start guides, if I may, that will, I think, enable a lot of people, and that will give a lot of people confidence on, oh yeah, even if I don't know all of this inside out, it's okay. If I just apply these basic principles, I'm still on the right path. So I would love to share some websites. So one is actually a set of posters, and it's on GitHub. I'll share the link with you, but it's all about okay, how do you design something for people on the autistic spectrum, right? Screen readers and someone with low vision. dyslexia. So it's a series of posters. It's like, think about like do's and don'ts. So there's a do's section, do this and don't do this, etc. There's also, so there's WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guide. So they have their own, like they recently came out with like flashcards. So again, no need to go through, there is a need to go through the detailed documentation, but if you want to get a jump start, they came up with these like flashcards recently. So just going through these quick flashcards also, it's very helpful. Especially with like one-line statements, like, what do you do when you are building something for low vision or something for deaf, someone deaf, etc. So I think just skimming through these like bullet points are also very helpful. And it just like reinforces the fact that, yes, accessibility is important. Whenever I build my next app, I will make sure to at least like read some of these guidelines. Maybe I won't be able to incorporate everything, but even if I can incorporate something, it'll be helpful, right? So, yeah.
Excellent. We'll make sure we get those links and put them in the show notes so folks can go and look at those. Before we get on to some quick fire questions, who do you recommend as a guest for a future episode?
So, Mark, I work with this like amazing person. So her name is Maria Acevedo. She is our accessibility champion. So she belongs to one of our like design studios at Avanade. She's out of Toronto. And I see her fearlessly leading this whole like accessibility initiative within Avanade in a very like grassroots like fashion, which I love. I always observe her sharing information and leading discussions. And, unfortunately, because of the nature of my job, I don't get to participate in those discussions very often. But I'm observing her on Teams, and sometimes I have discussions with her. I think she will add so much value to this whole topic of accessibility, and especially in terms of like how to build accessible and inclusive solutions. She has so much to offer, and I'm like in complete awe. When it comes to her knowledge and her kindness, when it comes to sharing, I definitely recommend her.
Awesome. Okay, I'll get you to introduce her.
Yeah, will do for sure. And, I'll just a quick plug for her to your listeners. If you can follow her on LinkedIn, she shares an amazing, a lot of content on LinkedIn as well. So if you're looking for some really cool stuff, I would definitely encourage you all to follow her.
Fantastic. Okay, here's your quick fire questions. Okay, what's something about you that surprises people when they first hear it?
I'm an introvert.
Interesting. Would you rather die before your partner or after?
Oh, wow. Before.
If you had to change your name for whatever compulsory reason that was invented, what would you change it to?
Michael Stipe, because he's my hero, the lead singer of REM.
I was going to make a joke about that after you talked about not making the but I'm like, I don't know if people get it. Yeah. Well, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on the show, Venkat. I hope people really take to heart what we've discussed and start applying it not only in their creations, but also in their businesses.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for giving me a platform to, say what I wanted to say. And I think you're doing a phenomenal job, like helping people like us spread our word and spread our message. And of course, it's not just my initiative, right? So accessibility is something that's extremely important. But yeah, once again, thank you for having me, and thank you for this opportunity.
Hey, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Business Application MVP, Mark Smith, otherwise known as the NZ365 guy. If there's a guest you'd like to see on the show, please message me on LinkedIn and let me know. If you like the show and you want to be a supporter, please go to buymeacoffee.com/NZ365 guy. Thanks again, and see you next time.